As you're logging in, please take a moment to rename yourself with your name, your organization, and your pronouns. It's great to see all of you, and we'll get started in just a minute. We recognize here at JPro that it's important to start on time, and that on time has a different meaning than it once did. So we'll give people another 30 seconds or so before we formally begin. And as I'm sharing my words of introduction, people can continue to log in. We're excited that you're here to join us for this conversation. And now I can formally welcome you. It's great to see all of you, and we're pleased that you're joining us for Why We Do What We Do, Motivation, Choice, and Career, a conversation between Dr. Arielle Levites, Managing Director of the Collaborative for Applied Jewish Studies, and Ilana Aisen, JPro CEO. My name is Laura Herman, and I am the Associate Director of Program and Evaluation here at JPro. JPro is the organization that is by, of, and for all professionals who work at Jewish nonprofit organizations across the United States and Canada. Our session today is going to be recorded and will be shared on our YouTube channel once it's ready. And closed captioning is also available, which you can access at the bottom of your screen. I believe it's the 3 dots, and if you hit show subtitles, you should be able to see it. I'm going to ask my colleague Erica to share the bios of our presenters in the chat, and you can read those as I introduce our topic for today. Our conversation in the next hour will be about the career trajectories of Jewish educators study. And our goal is really to learn about how this study is being used in the field and to spend some time thinking together about the implications of the research. JPro has been particularly interested in this study because it connects deeply to our work as conveners and providers of professional development in the field. Jewish educators are a large subsector of the Jewish nonprofit sector, and it's particularly interesting for us to learn about their careers, some of the challenges that they face, and how they think about professional development. Before we turn it over to Ilana and Arielle, I'd like to ask you to take a brief moment to share in the chat about what brought you here. Feel free to share a question, something that you hope to gain from the session, or anything else that moved you to join us. I'll give you a couple of seconds to think about that. And if you would enter it into the chat, that would be really helpful so we can learn a little bit about where you're coming from. Thank you for getting us started.
These are great.
It's great to see how people are coming from different angles and thinking about this study in different ways and the implications for your own work. I'm going to now pass it over to Ilana and Arielle to start us off with this conversation.
Laura, thank you so much. It is really wonderful to see so many old friends of JPro and new friends of JPro. We're really delighted to be here together with all of you. Arielle, thank you so much for agreeing to join us. It feels personally and professionally significant to have this time to be in conversation with you today.
Thanks for having me. I just want to say I'm a personal beneficiary of some of JPro's work, so it's especially gratifying to be here.
Thank you so much, Arielle. So I want to thank you all for contributing in the chat. I want to admit that as a moderator, I am a sort of fair to lousy moderator of chat while moderating, but we really want to invite you to be in conversation in the chat. I can't promise that I will see everything. I may catch some things and bring them into the discussion, but our amazing director of Zoom In with JPro and so many of our other programs, Laura Herman, will be moderating the chat and will be able to surface some of your questions during the Q&A. So we look forward to that being a really alive part of our conversation. One of the things that I did catch in the chat was this notion of being able to understand invisible barriers. I thought that was really beautiful and spot on, and very much aligned with what JPro is thinking about, and Arielle, I believe CASJE as well. So with that, we're going to dive in. Arielle, I'd like to start with just some grounding questions to sort of locate us in the big picture, and then turn to the themes of some of the briefs. So to begin, I wonder if you could tell us just what is CASJE? It is another Jewish community acronym. We have so many, but what is it? And also just to personalize it a little bit, what inspired you to take the helm of this organization?
Okay, that's a great question. So CASJE, it's a bit of a mouthful. It stands for the Collaborative for Applied Studies in Jewish Education. And our mission is to build an evidence base to fuel improvements in Jewish education. We're housed in the Graduate School of Education and Human Development at George Washington University, excuse me. So I would say, just in terms of what excites me and inspires me about CASJE's mission and our work, as someone who cares a great deal about Jewish education and the vitality of American Jewish life, I would say that in the United States, we invest considerable time, money, and energy into designing and delivering Jewish education programs, but we often have limited insight into how these programs actually work or what outcomes they might be producing. And so a big question for me is, how do we know that the good work to which we dedicate our time and our energy and our resources, that those programs are really set up to accomplish what we hope they will? So CASJE is dedicated to making positive change in Jewish educational settings by generating useful knowledge, getting evidence-based, actionable ideas into the field to improve Jewish education. And a lot of the things come to the table when we are making educational decisions, designing educational programs. Those include our values, our traditions, relationships, things we've learned in the wisdom of practice. And all of those things have a place at the table. But at CASJE, we believe that good data and evidence should also be something that guides our choices. Because the truth is, a lot of times decisions are made out of habit, ideology, or anecdote. And CASJE thinks that we could do better for Jewish education and our learners.
Thank you. I really appreciate the emphasis on what I believe is called applied research. You talked about connecting evidence to action. You said earlier, I've been scribbling down notes as you speak, and you talked about evidence to fuel improvement. And fuel is like such a it's a really active word choice. So that feels exciting and promising, and part of why JPro is excited about this research. And I'm also noticing in the chat a couple of the comments that are still still in my feed. How do we make Hillel a great or better place for Jewish educators? As a supervisor, I'm excited to learn from the study and connect these learnings to my team. I'm really excited about that orientation of CASJE, and of those of you who are joining us live or watching the video later. My sense, Arielle, is that this conversation will neither be at 100,000 feet nor completely on the ground, but that it'll be close enough to the ground that folks who are thinking about the research will be able to think about what action can they take to fuel improvement based on the data?
Yeah, and I just also want to acknowledge that I see, commenting in the chat and faces on the screen, actually a lot of people who were thought partners in developing this study, because I think, one of the ways that we think that, that we're committed to doing applied research well is actually in bridging divides between research and practice and really trying to bring in the wisdom of practitioners and policymakers at all stages of the research cycle. So I just want to acknowledge that a lot of people who've contributed to that ongoing process are also here today. So it's great to see you.
That's so wonderful. Thank you. All right. I think that a lot of us on the call are familiar with the study, and the briefs are online, but if you could just give us the really concise grounding, just so that everyone can sort of show up understanding what the briefs are if they're new.
Okay. So I actually always really like to begin with the point, which is probably not lost on this group, but I just think is important when I'm framing, the study and why it's important, is that educators matter. So research in general, K through 12 education has shown that the most important school-based factor in student outcomes, right, in actual learner outcomes, in the things I guess we hope that our programs produce, right, those are the teachers themselves. So teachers matter. And I think that sometimes this insight has led us to design interventions that really kind of focus or center on the individual talents and achievements of any one teacher, rather than how we structure teaching as a profession, how we support teachers' professional growth, how we recruit them, how we prepare them. Those are actually all things that really matter for learner outcomes, right? And that's what we care about at CASJE, high quality learning. So to that end, the study consists of 4 interrelated strands. It's very complex. There are hundreds of pages. And in a minute, I'll drop into the chat a link that you can go to read the reports and briefs, some of which are still forthcoming. But each of these 4 strands are organized around a central research question. And the idea is that they examine career trajectories and experiences of Jewish educators from multiple vantage points. So the big animating questions include: what does it take to launch a career in Jewish education? What factors induce educators to stay in the field? What supports their professional growth? What does the labor market look like for Jewish education, for Jewish educators? And then the last piece, a census to estimate the size of the Jewish education workforce. So again, the study is really designed to produce data that can inform actionable ideas, right? If we supported Jewish educators differently, what might that mean for our ability to attract and retain skilled professionals? And I just want to acknowledge that the study was funded by generous grants from the William Davidson Foundation and the Jim Joseph Foundation. And we worked with 2 research teams, Rosov Consulting and the Greenberg team, to produce these reports and briefs. So that's
Arielle.
kind of like the snapshot of it.
Perfect. Thank you. One last grounding question.
Sure.
How did you define educator for the purpose of the research?
Good. That's a great question. So like the summary is we defined it fairly broadly, and I've just dropped into the chat a link that will take you to the reports and briefs, including some detailed methodology sections that I'm not going to get like too in the weeds about today. Mm-hmm. So I would say that this study had a broader view of who a Jewish educator is than some previous cuts into studying the Jewish education workforce. So for this study, we defined Jewish educator as people who are post-college age, working for pay, could be full-time or part-time, right? So it doesn't include volunteers. And those who are working directly with people, so those involved in direct instruction in a range of settings to help participants find meaning in Jewish texts, experiences, and community. So we know that Jewish education takes place in many kinds of places. We have, inside and outdoors, in person and online. So we really tried to look across various sectors, formal education. So for example, a day school or early childhood setting, informal or experiential youth groups, camps, JCCs, engagement and social justice, Repair the World, One Table, communal organizations, which could include federations or JCRCs. And then the last sector, Sector 5, which is non-organizational networks. So independent tutors, some online, fully online education platforms, for example, Shalom Learning, things like that.
That's so helpful. As you know, Arielle, the JPro team has started a practice of staff learning every Friday morning, and we've been reading the briefs as our first venture into regular staff learning. And one of the questions that we've been asking ourselves, the population we serve is the field as a whole, the whole workforce, which includes everyone who's within the scope of this study, and people who might be considered to be more in back office roles, people in fundraising roles, people in senior management roles, sort of like the whole gamut. And it's been really, really interesting to ask ourselves which of the findings apply very specifically to Jewish educators, and which relate to the fields as a whole. And when we get to talking about professional development later, I think there are some interesting considerations there. Okay, before we get into the meat, Arielle, is there anything that I should have asked you just to sort of ground the research before we move into some of the specifics?
I mean, I think you've set this up with some great questions, and I'll just say, like, it's very hard for me to imagine a Jewish education that is going to meet its own goals for success without educators who are supported to do the work well. And I also just want to acknowledge that there, in a lot of settings, and this includes general education and Jewish education, there really is a struggle right now. We're facing a teacher shortage. There are struggles to recruit teachers. So I think it's really, it feels quite urgent, I know, for a lot of institutions right now. How can we support people? How can we get them into the classroom or other kinds of settings and really ground them in the knowledge and skills and competencies that they need to be great teachers and educators, and see themselves as having a career in Jewish education?
As you're speaking, I'm thinking about what you're saying is so mission aligned with JPro that it feels just so simpatico. For JPro, the professionals are at the center. We really believe and advocate for a recognition that no philanthropic investment in anything related to Jewish communal life, Jewish organizations, can be realized without engaged, well-equipped, well-supported professionals, right? And I think there's a way, I imagine, it's a little bit like apple pie, like that expression, like who could argue with the importance of professionals or educators? And I think the tension actually emerges when priorities are in tension. Like, so I'll give an example from our world, and then maybe you have others. But so for us, we notice that professional development dollars are often the first to be cut. Right, when the budget is tight, it's like, okay, well, that line is optional. And so it's all well and good to believe that the professionals are important, but sort of what do we do when there's a difficult choice point, and do we really walk the talk? So I'm curious to hear, have there been moments either in the creation of the study or in the reception where you're experiencing that tension? Like, yeah, the educators are important, but so are the learners, so is the subject matter. Like, why are we putting all the emphasis, are educators really at the center? So yeah, any tensions or difficulties that you're noticing with that prioritization?
Yeah, well, I mean, I will just say, like, in my sort of understanding of like the theory of education, right, you have sort of like an instructional triangle, right? And you're nodding because it's probably familiar to a lot of people, right? So you have like the educators, the content, the learners, and then in a larger set of milieus that kind of inform and shape the values and ideals. And so like, you definitely can't have a triangle without that third vertex or whatever is the proper geometric term there. But I will say that one thing that I have just come to appreciate in my work at CASJE, partially through this this study, career trajectory study, and part also through another study we worked on about family engagement in the context of early childhood education, is that a lot of Jewish educational institutions are not actually headed up by educators, right? So some of the places where the most number of people are accessing Jewish education, were not necessarily designed to deliver Jewish education. They were designed to meet other kinds of goals, of which education might be one piece. And they're often not headed up by people who have a background per se in education, because people who come through kind of, any kind of educational program have a deep appreciation for the role of professional learning and the role, the importance of understanding teachers as learners, and the relationship between that and outcomes, right? That's actually something we can trace in terms of, evidence in general education. And so the idea that, professional learning is sort of, is a kind of optional thing that is just maybe like the a la mode on the pie, kind of, right? It's not actually the meal that we're delivering, or doesn't actually impact the nutrition or the taste or the conviviality around the table. I think that's actually probably conceptually like a poor understanding of what professional learning means in the context of education, which is what the evidence tells us, certainly at least in general education. So
I'm very excited about the content of what you're saying, and I'm very excited that you found a way to extend the apple pie metaphor. That was amazing. All right, I want to move ahead to talk about the motivations brief and the motivations of educators. And I'm going to ask what feels to me a little bit like a tongue-in-cheek sort of like chutzpahdik, like what is a way to translate chutzpahdik? Like not quite obnoxious, but like pushing the boundary kind of a question. We asked some very big questions in the session description. Audacious, thank you, Manny. I was searching for the right word. So my chutzpahdik audacious question is, I actually want to ask you to answer the questions that we asked in the session description, and it sort of feels a little bit silly because these are such big questions, but actually I think that you have some great data. So I'm going to read them, and I think a member of the team is also going to put them in the chat. What is the motivation behind the career choices of many in our sector? Is this work a calling? Do we think of this as a career or a job? And I think most importantly, what are the implications of those distinctions for how we recruit, retain, and develop talent?
Okay.
So
I'm so glad, what are we, we're here to ask meaty questions. So I'm really glad that you're asking these questions. So first of all, I just want to say that any research study always involves a series of decisions, right? So our definition of who an educator is, that's an example of decisions that we made that we want to really be transparent about so people can understand, how we came to collect the data that we have and interpret it the way we do. So I would say that equally a key decision that really framed the study design and the research was to characterize work in Jewish education as a career, right? And to sort of distinguish that between a job, which is a little bit more sort of like what we do maybe to pay the bills, career, right? So that's kind of like an ongoing commitment to professional growth and advancement within one's field of work. And then calling, to distinguish also from calling in the sense that it's work related to one's larger sense of purpose, right? So to be invested in a career or to think of work as a career means that over the course of time, right, we're going to stay in this and develop a set of skills. And I do want to acknowledge that a lot of people see the concept of calling as doing work that transcends categories like job and career, that it serves a greater good. And I think that's beautiful and that's wonderful. But I think we also just want to call attention that when we frame the work of education as a calling, that there actually is a cost to that. And I think that there's a cost that's incurred both by the educators doing the work and actually the people they serve as well, to the people they serve, the learners, our communities. Because if we think of the work of education as primarily a calling, then what it's built on, right, are things like faith, inspiration, and charisma. Okay, and it doesn't lend itself necessarily to investment in technical know-how, content knowledge, or skills, right? And if your work is a calling, then your employer doesn't actually need to think about, you're so committed in investment, they don't have to think invested in it. They don't have to think about your workplace conditions or your compensation or the professional learning that they're providing. And it's tied obviously to the religious nature, I think, of the work, but also mythologies about teaching in general in the US. And sorry, I feel like I want to also squeeze Canada in there, but I'm actually less familiar with so I'm actually not comfortable saying that.
Right.
Just knowing that different countries really do have different cultures of understanding who teachers are and how they structure that work. And I'll say that American Jewish education, by which I mean in the US, is incredibly American US, okay? Right, and in this story, right, teaching is a caring profession. It's a female profession. Teachers are supposed to make sacrifices for their students, help them overcome all kinds of problems, like they should spend their own money for school supplies, or go to some heroic efforts that seem to involve turning poetry into rap, if you've seen all those movies, right? There's this whole culture of the mythos of the teacher who's so giving that through their natural talent and generosity, right, they're going to be inspiring enough to break through a bad system. And that's actually that's altruism, right? That's not professionalism. And I think that there's a cost to that. I think because one, it assumes that what it takes to be a good teacher are these personal qualities of generosity and selflessness that mean that they should care about their work so much that they don't mind low salaries or no benefits or lack of opportunities for advancement or not want to organize. You see that, in the general education, unions and things are counter to good learning or students, et cetera. But I also think there's actually a cost to learners. And that's what I also want to highlight, because it assumes that what is going to help people learn is not some coherently designed, well-resourced, evidence-based system, right? Instead, we need to find these special, talented individuals who will save us and break through the system. And I just don't think that's a particularly promising model for any educational system, let alone Jewish education. And I don't think, and I really want to be clear to say that that doesn't mean that caring and commitment and trust don't matter, because at the ground floor, at the most foundational level, trust and respect have to be at the foundation of an educator's responsibilities to their learners. But we have to really be thinking about content knowledge and pedagogic content knowledge and technical know-how. And I think that if those aren't part of our picture of who an educator is in Jewish education, that's not good for the educators, and it's not good for Jewish education and our learners.
There is so much richness in what you just shared, Arielle. I feel like I just learned 10 new things. One thing that really jumped out at me is you early on, you used the word purpose. And the thought I had was, for me personally in my work, I don't really relate to the frame of calling. It feels like, when I was a teenager and I was in youth group and I thought maybe I want to become a rabbi. It felt well, that path would have been a calling, but the job I do feels like I feel so lucky that I get to do work that I love and that fuels meaning for me and isn't, a lot of people have jobs that might feel more, as you said, like collecting a paycheck. And I'm thinking a little bit about some of the downsides of calling, like some of the risks and difficulties that you just surfaced. I wonder if the purpose frame is actually like a healthier or more productive frame that guards, like has different guardrails against some of the risks and pitfalls that you described.
Yeah, and I guess I also want to acknowledge that there are a lot of educators who do think that they're called to the work and see their work as a calling. And I don't want to demote that, or take that away from them, because it's sacred work. And I can't deny that in any way, because as someone who's, been a teacher in the classroom, there's a great new book that came out by a labor journalist that's something, I think the title something like Work Won't Love You Back. But the thing is, like, when you're an educator, like, actually work can love you back in a way that's really powerful. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that. But if we're just going to like coast on the good feeling, right, and not actually have like the guardrails of professionalism, then actually like a lot of things can go wrong. And one of the things is that we might not actually be able to deliver on the promise that we make about how central education and Torah and teaching in all kinds of forms is in Jewish life.
I wonder if there's a distinction between how we leave space for educators who come at the work from all kinds of postures, but where we say actually the system has to be created in a way that doesn't rest on a sort of flimsy or problematic foundation of, well, the educators are called and therefore we don't need to do X or we do Y. Like, we need an appropriate container.
Right. I mean, I think we also just have to, so one of the things that we found in our study, and this is in, if you're looking for it, it's in the Preparing for Entry report, but like what distinguishes somebody who goes into the field of Jewish education, who wants to launch a career in Jewish education versus other people, not like in the general American Jewish community, but actually versus other people who participate in intensive fellowships and Jewish learning experiences. So if this is all like a good pool of potential candidates, like what are the things that distinguish the people who actually go into a career in Jewish education? And the thing, right, that sets them apart, right, from those others in these intensive programs is what we call their sense of mission, right? So their commitment to Jewish learning, their commitment to doing work that helps others, and their belief that working in Jewish education provides a sense of larger life purpose. So I think we have to kind of I just don't think the Jewish community really knows that or appreciates that about who their educators are, first of all. Like, what motivates them to show up for us and our families, right? They're Jewish educators because they want to be, because they believe in the work. So and they're just committed to it. And right, so how are we going to support them? But if we frame Jewish education as solely about personal mission, like what that means is kind of, we just think that that's going to be enough, right? Then we're just missing the opportunities to give them professional learning, access to supervision, support from instructional leadership. And it doesn't mean like we want to take away their sense of higher purpose, but it's just not good for Jewish educators or Jewish education if like the mission is all that's there. And I will say that I think that it's a finding that like sometimes I worry that how it could be used, right? Like if we just, well, they already care and they're mission driven, so let's just boost their sense of mission and their sense of caring so they'll never leave us. Right? I have heard interpretations of the data a little bit aligned with that story. And so I would caution us, right, to think like that's who's coming to do the work, but what actually sets them up to do the work well and to stay and not get burned out? Like like, that's what brings them into the door, but if we want them to actually grow as professionals, and support them in the sacred role they serve with dignity and professionalism, like there are things that we need to give them.
I love dignity and professionalism. I mean, right. I'm writing those down and holding them. I think that's a really good sort of summary of how do we hold the two.
Yeah. I mean, if you don't mind, I would love to pose a question to you, if that's
sure.
Okay. Because that is, and I think you've already mentioned it, I just actually really want to lift up, right, as a great model of what evidence-based professional development looks like, right? And that is something that you're doing as a staff at JPro, right? Where you are together as colleagues, reading research, right? Discussing research to inform your practice. And I was just wondering if you could like share a little bit about how you frame your own internal professional learning at JPro, the role of research in that. I think I would love to hear more about that.
Thanks for that question, Arielle. I want to acknowledge my colleague Laura Herman once again. This is a new venture for JPro, and Laura's background is as an educator and as an academic who studies education. She has an EDD from the Davidson School, and so I think. So I'll say a couple of things. One is this intervention came out of an earlier intervention, which when COVID began, we said we need like a different structure of team meetings. We were a remote team already, and we were doing team building. So we had the slot, and we were doing things that were more playful, getting to know one another. And it felt like in terms of the moment in our organization's development, we wanted another layer of like intellectual grounding for the work. I think we were working a lot, like you talked about anecdote. I think we were working a lot on intuition, which has such an important role. But we're not a 120-year-old startup anymore. We're like, we're established in a different kind of a way. And so taking seriously our responsibility for thought leadership, for not only reading the research, but being accountable to one another that we're reading it. There are lots of jokes about like who does their homework and how do they do their homework. So that's, I guess, a little bit of an answer. And really in terms of the method, what Laura's done is she's broken up the reading for us just to make it accessible. Like it wasn't an assignment to read like hundreds of pages and then come ready to discuss all of it. So that made the discussion accessible. She always brings a couple of prompts and we bring our observations, and it's that beautiful experience of like it goes down one path or another path and a tangent, and we're talking about statistics one moment and our own personal stories in another. So it's been a joy, and it, as I said, it's a relatively new practice for us.
So, I mean, I think it sounds fantastic. I'm like so honored that the CASJE study has is on your curriculum, and I'm going to be joining you later this week and looking forward to it. But I just really want to, call it out as, I think that sometimes there's a lack of alignment. And again, this might be where there's the important to make the distinction of, our work at CASJE is really focused on education, not in the nonprofit sector more broadly, and very different kinds of professional roles that people might have. But in terms of like what our models are for professional learning in Jewish education, there's often a lack of alignment between like what is actually happening in the field and what the research evidence, at least in general education, tells us actually leads to improvements in learner outcomes. So I think in Jewish communal life, we love leaders. We love leadership fellowships, which are often for administrators, not for teachers. That's not bad, right? But when we think of like what's usually available to educators themselves, what we found is that the one-shot workshop, right? So like somebody comes in, talks for a few hours about a hot topic, and then you go back to the reality of your work. That's what, when people have access to PD, that's usually what they're getting. And that's not really shown to be effective for improving teaching and learning. And what has been shown to be effective in general education is a lot more like your research reading group that you're doing at JPro, right? So it's coherent and ongoing. It's workplace embedded. We would say it's teacher led, but here it's like led, right, by somebody who's part of your staff. In this case, it's actually a very talented educational leader. It involves collaboration with colleagues. Another piece I would say in the evidence is that it would be grounded in artifacts of practice, right? So what's happening in the day-to-day work that teachers do. And I was just talking earlier this week with somebody on, his name's Henry Brown. He's on my advisory board at CASJE. He's a national expert in assessment and testing, and he's like statistics and numbers and measurement. And he, he was just saying, well, a lot of PG doesn't work. But you know what does work, right? And he was giving an example, right? And it just like, I think this just kind of aligns with some of the things that we're talking about and that you're launching internally at JPro, right? So he was saying it's having teachers, because he's an expert in assessment, right? So it's having teachers get together and talk about how they assess work, building rubrics together, talking about what they're looking for as evidence of learning, the choices that they're making. That's actually an evidence-based practice, a collegial, ongoing conversation grounded in artifacts of practice. And that's not fancy, right? That's not like, you don't need any newfangled technology or like super expensive speaker to fly in to do that, right? It's really grounded in reflexive practice to improve instruction. And I think there's a lot of good work to be done in that space in Jewish education, because at least our study shows that that's not necessarily really what's happening. And I guess the one other thing maybe I want to call attention to is, so one thing that we also learned is that Jewish educators, like if they want to advance in their work, they often have to leave direct instruction, or take on administrative roles, right? And so we have this kind of like tier that's missing in Jewish education that we do have in general education of teacher leaders. And those actually might be precisely the kind of people who are going to lead these collegial professional conversations, who are responsible for bringing research to their colleagues and making it bite-sized and accessible, and helping them work through it. For example, they could be offering coaching, observation, and feedback. And those, again, are the kinds of practices that are actually tied to improved outcomes for learners. And we just don't necessarily see a lot of that broadly across the field. And it would be great if more educators had access to that.
I am so happy that you went there. I had two more burning questions to ask you, and you just answered the first one, which is really thinking about how can a frontline professional, like someone who's directly interacting with student, client, etc., have an engaged, rewarding career where they stay in that role and don't move into like the back office or the supervisor of those people. Like, how does that become like as compelling, as accessible, as rewarding a career journey?
I mean, so again, like these kinds of pathways where there's acknowledgement, right, of excellence in instruction, and also in the capacity to support maybe more novice educators, or to lead change in practice or curriculum, et cetera, in educational settings. I mean, I'll say, I started out as a classroom teacher, and if I like reflect on why I really left teaching, as like, it was actually because I missed talking to adults. Because in American education, often, right, like you're just like your actual professional work is only with the learners. In my case, it was with, minors, with children. But in other countries, right, an educator's day-to-day actually may have a lot more collaboration with colleagues built in either to the daily or weekly cycle. So giving that opportunity to work with your colleagues to support each other's professional growth and improvement of practice, I think is really important as well.
I'm going to ask one last question. I have many more, and I just want to flag for all those who are joining us now. Now is the time, if you have questions, to make sure to get them into the chat. To wrap up our conversation, Arielle, I just want to say that I really appreciated, and you alluded to this at the beginning as well, that the briefs were explicitly tied to supporting policymaking. And I'm curious to hear a little bit about, who are the policymaking audiences in Jewish education, and what are some of the main threads of the response you're hearing from those audience, both any resistance and anything that's really where you're sort of seeing forward motion?
Yeah. Okay, so that's a really good question. So I do want to just say that the first public program we did was for educators, Jewish educators themselves. And we really do hope that educators will see their experiences and their aspirations and these reports. And I hope that it will give them maybe some insight into some of the larger structures that undergird, some of the opportunities and challenges they face. And that it might help them advocate for changes that they would like to see in their own workplaces to support improvements in instruction. So I hope they, individual educators may also find something in it. And also that researchers will make use of our data set. We already know that a doctoral program is using the data set to train up and coming researchers. So those are also audiences that we hope will benefit. But it's true that, we were really sort of writing for policy, let's say. And I have to just acknowledge that as much as, I have a habit of sort of saying, well, in general education this, or in general education that, that's one of those places where it doesn't work all that well. Because in general education, one, you just have a huge wealth of research knowledge, but you also have a very large audience of consumers, right, who are trained in policy writing, right? They're trained to use research to frame plans of action at a district level, a state level, a national level. And we don't have that so much in Jewish education, right? There's no authoritative agency that's going to come in and say, this is how you have to measure teacher effectiveness, or this ought to be your curriculum. So when we talk about policy at CASJE, we're kind of talking about three groups. So one are funders, who I would say in their grant making may sometimes operate as de facto policymakers. We're talking about national umbrella organizations that often serve as champions and thought leaders for some kind of sector or part of the Jewish education ecosystem. I see Anna Hartman there, right? So that's an example, right, with her work in early childhood. We have, what we call the metropolitan level leaders. So for a city, central agencies and federations. And so we work with them also primarily through ADCA, which is an association of the directors of all the central agencies. So we've been working with those groups in all kinds of ways. And I think that, research to policy working groups, webinars, those kinds of things. And I think there's a lot of excitement, I would say, about having these data available, and a lot of interest in working with CASJE to kind of facilitate a stakeholder meaning-making process to set strategic priorities that may emerge from the data. But I also say that using research evidence is a professional skill, and not everyone has had access to professional education that's actually inducted them into the skill of using research evidence, right? So there are some organizations that are very sophisticated about it. UJA Federation has an in-house sociologist, right? But I think in many organizations, there's interest and desire to be data informed that sometimes can outpace capacity to use data. And that's something that we care a lot about at CASJE as well, right? So it's not just about high quality research. It's about increasing the capacity of the field to be good consumers and
Mhm.
users of research. And so we're just really open to working with people to in the way that they need, that's kind of boutique and not cookie cutter, to help practitioner leaders, unpack the data, work with stakeholders to use the data to frame actionable ideas.
This has been such a phenomenal conversation. With 10 minutes left to go, I'm going to hand it over to Laura to moderate. Probably have time for a question or two.
Thank you both. This was enriching and interesting, and I appreciate you engaging in the dialogue. I've received a couple of questions. One is around how we can support educators. I think that both of you in various ways have referenced what does it mean to be supported to do the work well? And particularly at this moment where there might be high levels of burnout or other feelings based on where we are in the pandemic, I'm curious how we can support educators more.
That's a great question. And I think that there are, and it's very hard to kind of like summarize all of the work that's been published and that's coming out. But I will just say, when people talk about like why they leave the field of Jewish education, right? They talk about, they talk about compensation, right? They talk about toxic workplace environments. They talk about lack of career advancement opportunities and lack of access to professional growth. So a lot of the things that we're talking about actually have implications for retaining teachers. I do find that sometimes there's discomfort about talking about the compensation and benefits piece of this, in part because, I think this goes back to your earlier comment about apple pie, right? Like, how do we bear in a tuition model, like how do we bear a cost, right, of increasing compensation for educators where we know that there's differences, women are still making less than men in a female dominated field. We see pretty big disparities, for example, in salaries to early childhood educators than to educators in some of the other sectors and venues that we look like how do we really tackle that issue? Because when we look to general education, when we think about what are interventions that actually work in terms of increasing recruitment and retention for people entering the field of teaching, it turns out that compensation is an intervention that has been demonstrated to work in bringing people into the field and keeping them there. And that I don't know that we have the capacity or the will, I'll say, in Jewish education or Jewish communal life to really tackle that. But I do think that we cannot avoid talking about it. And we have a brief about specifically compensation and benefits. And when you look at the kind of benefits that full-time educators receive from their workplaces, and you understand that like not everybody's getting, like a big proportion is not getting medical benefits, where that's a kind of political thing that like who knows what might come in the future in a global pandemic. That's hard to look at and feel good about. So I do think that even though those are scary questions because they feel expensive and that we can't afford them, I think we can't pretend that they're not there. So that's one thing I would say. Yeah. And we also heard a lot, sometimes about the challenges of workplace environments, some of which have to just do with, a bad personality in a particular place, and some of which are kind of sometimes more structural about challenges in Jewish communal life, the status afforded to educators in the community and in institutions, et cetera, as well.
I also want to highlight Rafi's question, one of Rafi's questions in the chat, about ways that we can think about the term calling and how that relates to professional development, and if there are ways that those don't necessarily need to be in conflict. And I'm paraphrasing what Rafi said, but I'm curious to hear a little bit more about that.
I mean, I don't know that they need to be in conflict in the sense that like not everyone is suited to be an educator, right? And so when we like think about, people who drop out, for example, which is it can be a fairly large proportion of people who start a career in education and then drop out in the first 5 years. And that's true in Jewish education and general education. Some people just like aren't suited for the work, right? Because you actually you have to have a certain sensibility and disposition and certain interests and proclivities. And I think those are, you have to feel, and we could call that called, we can call that inspired, we can call that mission driven, right? But what helps us stay and do the work well, and feel, because I do think, look, there's a lot also, I would say, in Jewish communal life, there's a kind of, trying to think, Sarah Benor and a research team had a great phrase for it. And now I'm sort of blanking on what they called it, but it's kind of a discourse of failure, right? There's a discourse of failure in Jewish education. We're not doing enough. We're not doing it well enough. We're losing people. We're some, schlocky delivery system for something not very good. That doesn't feel very good. Like, educators are there because they care about the work and they want to do it well. So if we really want to see Jewish education succeed, and if we really claim that it's at the center of our culture and our, enduring commitments, right, to who we are and where we come from, then we have to take the gift we're given, right, which are these mission-driven educators, the people who do have a calling, and say, thank you so much for coming to us. We're so thrilled that you bring that sense of commitment to the work and that love of Jewish learning. Now, like, let's set you up with the professional know-how that you need to do your job well, so that we can all say, wow, this is a success. I think that's what we all would like to see.
I think the word reciprocity just came to mind, Arielle. Like, you are here, you are so invested, and we are building infrastructure and systems within this institution and the field that will invest in you. Yeah.
Educators are there, Jewish educators are there because they want to be there, because they care about the work. And that's something they're bringing to the table. So we really need to meet them with the professional skills so that they can do that work well.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry that we don't have more time to answer all of the questions in the chat. I really appreciate everyone putting their questions there, and hopefully we can continue this dialogue in different ways moving forward. I want to just take a moment to thank both Arielle and Ilana for this enriching conversation. You brought up a lot of excellent points about how educators see themselves in their work and the ways that all the institutions where they work can support them. I'd like to just invite you, before we wrap up, to please take a moment to share your feedback on this session with us. It really helps us think about our work at JPro and ways that we can serve you better. And I'd also like to invite you to our next Zoom in session, which will be on the gender gap in leadership in partnership with Leading Edge. And my colleague Shlomo has put a link to find out more information on that in the chat. It's coming up in December. And I hope everybody has a good rest of your day. Thank you again for being part of this conversation and sharing and listening to these insights about this research. Thank you. Bye.